Hello everyone. How's it going? Hope you're having a lovely day or an afternoon perhaps or an evening. This is Dr. Zizzi. It's a lovely kind of sunny breezy day here in Morgantown. And I want to welcome you to the podcast for Chapter 12. So this chapter really matches up with Chapter 4, which is the chapter on anxiety, arousal, and stress. And I'm going to overview in this chapter the different methods of regulating your arousal and anxiety, the intervention techniques, that are appropriate, and then also I'm going to overview what's called coping and how athletes can learn different coping skills and the different types of coping skills that are used by athletes. I highly encourage you to spend some time on the assignments for this particular unit because you do get an opportunity to practice progressive muscle relaxation exercise and also an imagery exercise to sample your own skills. And don't be frustrated if you're not doing it well or you're not seeing results initially. A lot of times you have to really get some repetition before these skills work. So the first few times you do breathing, it probably will not work. So it may relax you a little bit. You may find it kind of frustrating trying to follow the instructions. Just give it a shot and be open about it and then see how it goes. And then just evaluate it. And so from there, if you can do it in a non-judgmental way, just try to learn the skill without too much bias, then I think you have a little bit more of a positive experience with it. Okay? So let's just review back to Chapter 4. Why would you want to help athletes regulate their arousal? Is that it's going to decrease your performance. If you're able to regulate it and stay within your individual zone of performance, if you remember that theory back from Chapter 4, then you're more likely to actually get into a flow or get into the zone. So athletes need to recognize two really different scenarios. One is when they're under aroused, which is much less common, as you can imagine, when maybe you're feeling very overconfident or you're not really prepared for this event, or it's maybe an early morning. It's like you ever watch a lot of WVU football games that start at noon, and it seems like both of the teams really haven't woken up. That's really a sign of under arousal. They're not properly physically and mentally prepared to compete at that time. So that's under arousal. But more commonly, probably 80 or 90% of the time, athletes need to regulate their arousal down so they can calm themselves down. And if they can do that, they can stay a little bit more focused, feel more confident, but most importantly, they don't disrupt the physical training, because one of the biggest downsides of being overly aroused and overly stressed before a competition, in the days leading up to a competition, is you just waste energy. So then fatigue will beat you down, and it will make cowards of us all, as the quote says. And so if you've really wasted your energy for several days being nervous, by the time you get to competition, it may not matter what you do because your gas tank is simply out of fuel. I always like this quote, and it's totally true. I mean, you'll hear athletes at the highest level, Jordan and Tiger and Steffi Graf and other elite athletes, talk about that they were nervous just like everybody else, but they were able to get them moving in the right direction. In other words, they were able to interpret it in a way that meant I'm ready to go. And so it's not a case of having an athlete feel 100% confident or not at all nervous, getting rid of the butterflies. It's a case of getting them to fly in formation. That's totally true, in the sense that you're getting them to work for you and not attack you like bees. That's the way I think of this. It's the butterflies flying in formation, working with me, or it's just bees kind of distracting you and really undermining your performance. So that's that facilitative interpretation coming from reversal theory in Chapter 4. These are the big categories, and I want you to read through each of these in your textbook and be able to identify the different techniques that fit under these categories. Sorry, I had to take a quick pause there. I want to go back and just make sure I get all the information straight on this slide. So the idea here is that you have different groups of techniques that are targeted at specific areas of anxiety or arousal management. So you probably have to think back to your Chapter 4 content. And so somatic anxiety has to do with feelings of anxiety in the body, tension, muscle tension, butterflies, having to pee all the time, sweating excessively. high heart rate, high blood pressure, so the physical symptoms of anxiety. Cognitive anxiety has to do with thoughts and distracting or negative thoughts. And then multimodal refers to packages that would treat both. So you have some techniques that are specifically focused on the physical part of it, such as breathing, deep breathing, meditation. And then you have specific techniques such as thought stopping that would focus on cognitive anxiety by itself, but have nothing really specific to deal with somatic anxiety. And then you have multimodal packages such as stress inoculation training, and you need to read more about that target both cognitive and somatic anxiety. So you identify which anxiety the athlete is experiencing, and then you choose the intervention technique that would help match that particular issue. I thought this is a useful way to show the combination of something that's multimodal. So you look up here between the different types of responses of the athlete. So you have both their physiological response, which results in their behavior. So this is like their actual performance and their change in their technique. And then up here you have their cognitive appraisal of the situation and of their own ability to cope. So here you have kind of their cognitive skill set, and then over here you have their physical skill set. In response to that, you have the interventions that would match. So here you have relaxation skills training, which would be a somatic anxiety reduction technique, and then you have cognitive restructuring training, which is a cognitive technique. And then between the two, you see an integrated coping response. So hopefully, and in most actual situations, you're usually doing a little bit of both. You're helping athletes control any sort of negative self-talk. You're also teaching them breathing and other very simple physical skills that are based off of progressive muscle relaxation, that are very physiologically driven, that help you just learn how a breath can relax the body. And before I forget, when you're practicing the relaxation training, the sample I provided is a very short, I think it's 5 to 7 minutes. And typically it would be at least twice that long, and it might take you several weeks of doing that every day, particularly if you're a highly nervous person, for you to see a real strong result out of that technique. So it's the repetition that is the magic, not necessarily just the actual skill itself. So both of these things, you need repetition with changing your self-talk, with learning how to breathe and calm yourself down. There's no magic in the actual technique. It's the magic is in the daily or the weekly practice of the technique. That process is the magic. So 4 phases, and this links briefly to the fairly closest to the last chapter we had, which was just the PST. So you assess their skills first. You try to establish a rationale for why you should begin this treatment to see some sort of improvement. What's it going to actually do for you? Because athletes don't want to waste time if they don't feel like it's going to help them. You then actually go through the training, and then you have skill rehearsal, which is similar to the acquisition phase. So you have acquisition, and then you rehearse it and you translate that into practice. So, in terms of helping athletes manage stress, you do an assessment, you figure out why you want to learn something, and then you integrate it into what they're doing. A special note on hypnosis, and there is quite a bit of information in your textbook on hypnosis, so you should be somewhat familiar with it for the quiz. I get a lot of questions about hypnosis from athletes, and they are concerned that I'm going to put them under some sort of voodoo spell, and some of them would actually prefer it probably, that they would just come in for a half hour and I would, put them into some sort of trance and fix them. And there are some practitioners that can use hypnosis. They're typically clinical sports psychologists. I'm an educational sports psychologist, and so hypnosis is not one of the things that I'm competent at. So there are some sports psych professionals who would practice hypnosis, but I do not. But I do want to dispel any myths related to hypnosis. So it's appropriate for about 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 athletes who are particularly open and have a suggestible type of personality. It has the same outcome goal. You want to change thoughts, feelings, and actions, but it is through a deepened state of self-relaxation. There is no sort of lack of control. You're still in control of that hypnosis. You're just allowing yourself to get into a deeper state so that then you can have some sort of messages or skills encoded when you're in a very open, non-judgmental state. And many people cannot get into that state because they're too guarded, either emotionally or cognitively. Okay, so check out the hypnosis. You do need to get specific training and have a certification, and be also at least at the master's level as a psychology practitioner in order to get that. Now, the matching hypothesis is very important coming out of this chapter, and the theory here is that you should match the symptom with the technique. So, if you have an athlete that has cognitive anxiety, a lot of negative self-talk and doubt, you should treat that with some sort of mental relaxation or cognitive reduction technique. Somatic anxiety should be treated with physical relaxation or progressive muscle relaxation. But really, in practice, you're going to use some sort of multimodal technique. Now, a couple different categories of coping that you should be familiar with are problem and emotion-focused coping. And the two general categories of coping. The problem-focused coping actually tries to fix the problem, and this is typically, gender bias. What guys trying to do, they try to fix it, and this is where kind of the Mars, women are from Mars, men are from Venus book comes apart, and why we get into a lot of conflict sometimes with people of the other gender is that our natural inclination towards trying to deal with stresses are different. Now, that doesn't mean you'll have that in all athletes. That's not the case, but problem-focused coping tries to deal with the issue. So you want to solve the problem, you want to manage your time, set goals, fix something. Okay, alter or manage the problems that are causing your stress. While emotion-focused coping, you want to just process. You want to talk through it. You want to meditate. You want to go and just drink and just forget about it. So you just want to deal with the stress that you're feeling. So it doesn't solve the problem, just treats the symptoms. Okay, so problem focus tries to fix the root cause, to change and relieve the stress. Emotion focus, more short term, wants to alleviate the stress that you're in right now. Okay, so it focuses more on a short term solution, and can be useful in some situations. And so, in terms of coping with difficult things, they're suited in different situations. So you'd like athletes to use coping, a problem-focused coping, when they have some opportunity to change that stressful situation. However, there are some times when the stress you're experiencing, you don't have the control over it. So, for example, let's say you have the loss of a loved one. That's something that you cannot change. So you need to figure out some sort of strategy to manage the emotions of that loss, because you're not going to reverse time and get that person back. So in that case, the problem-focused coping is not very effective. You can't do anything. Now, there's certain things you can focus on. You can use goals to get back into your life, but you do need to find some way to deal with the depression and manage those depressive things in a functional way. And it's probably not going out and drinking all the time or over-medicating with prescription painkillers or whatever. Okay, so problem-focused coping, useful when you can change it, and that's most situations in sport. Emotion-focused coping when less amenable to change. Okay, last couple slides here in this unit, and there's a lot more information in the unit that you should check out from your textbook. I just want to overview the simple tips for relaxing during a competition and then also increasing your arousal during a competition. And I have a little bit of disagreement with some of these, but these are straight from your textbook. Smile when you feel tension coming on is kind of a silly suggestion, but the idea is that if you start to notice yourself getting tense, the best way to deal with that is to interpret it in some sort of facilitative way, in the sense that, okay, hey, boy, I'm nervous, I must be ready to go. I'm excited, I'm ready for the challenge, versus, oh no, oh God, what's going to happen if? Okay, so if you can interpret those symptoms you're experiencing and enjoy it, then you will be able to then allow the butterflies to fly in formation. Okay, if you don't and you create a negative perception, then basically you turn those butterflies into bees, and you're going to be swatting them the whole time you're trying to compete. Okay, one way to get good at helping the butterflies fly in formation is to simulate situations in practice that are causing you stress in competition, so you can get an opportunity to prepare and use your strategies, to use your breath, to change your self-talk, and you can rehearse those things. And it seems very similar. I can remember going to a talk one time at a sports psych conference by a world-class decathlete, and his name was Dan O'Brien. He had competed in some Olympics in the 90s. And he talked at detail about how he would set up very specific scenarios in his training to simulate exactly what the competition would look like coming up for an Olympic trial or an Olympics or a world championship, down to the detail of exactly who he would be competing before. He would set up scenarios like, let's say, on the high jump where he had already missed the first 2 attempts, and so he had to make a clutch 3rd attempt, at that particular height. And so it was very, very detailed. So then he went into competition, and he suggested he was already there. He felt very confident because he had already been there in his mind and in his body. The thing that is hardest for athletes to do, that is the best thing you can learn, is how to stay focused right now in the present. Let me just do what I need to do and then worry about the consequences later. So this is, more of a Zen Buddhist principle, is let me just stay here in the moment and just ride this out and enjoy it. It relates back to the moment. Just take it in, enjoy it, and critique it later. So you want to suspend your brain while you're actually in the performance, unless you're really out of target, unless you're in a yellow or a red state and you need to totally reset. Other than that, you just want the athlete to stay in the moment, not judge it, play free, and will definitely help people feel less stressed. Because when you start to focus on the consequences of mistakes you made in the past or what may happen in the future, even if it's good or bad, now you're totally lost now, and you will come out of the flow. Now, on the flip side of that, less commonly, but athletes do need to understand this, is what can you do to help athletes increase their arousal so that they're more into the competition early on. So sometimes I'll work with athletes that they will go out and their first 4 or 5 holes of a golf match are terrible, or their first set of a tennis match, or whatever it is, their first repetition or the first quarter of a basketball game. They're just not into it. They're not there. So there's something with their pregame routine that's not getting them to the right place. And sometimes they're just erring on the side of not being nervous, so they try to be really confident and look, like they're feeling really good, but then they end up not being into it. And so one of the most important things that, in my opinion, that you can do is physiologically get your body more cranked up. So this part right here about completing a pre-competition workout or a proper warm-up that would get you physiologically to the right place is critical, so that you're physiologically warm, and then you're more likely then to be mentally engaged. Now you can imagine, sometimes you wake up and let's say you have to go to an early class, and really physically you're not really awake. You made yourself get up, maybe you've got a coffee or a Red Bull, but it hasn't kicked in yet, so physically you imagine trying to compete in that situation, you'd be dead. So one thing you can do to take control is go for a walk, go for a jog, and really physically warm up, and then it's a lot easier to get mentally engaged. But if you're not physically engaged, then it's hard to really pay attention. It's like being in class and you're half asleep, you're not learning anything. So you need to do something physically, and usually what students will do, of course, is caffeinate, and that cranks you up enough so that you're alert enough to actually learn. So you can do that by increasing your breathing rate, by acting energized, going through some sort of routines or activities or stretching to really get into it. A lot of athletes use music, affirmations along with that. So there's a variety of things that you can do, and you may identify this with athletes that this happens against certain competitions or in certain scenarios. So these techniques will be very useful to athletes to take control of that situation, not end up wasting 25%, 30%, 40% of their competition opportunities. So hopefully you got a decent introduction to the arousal reduction and arousal-inducing techniques. I encourage you to try them out and then read more thoroughly in the chapter about these so you're prepared for the quiz. Enjoy the rest of your day.